It is the most beautiful killer in history. A fragile, trembling bloom with petals of paper-thin white, pink, or bruised purple. It looks innocent. It looks harmless. But inside its swollen green pod lies a milky tear that has toppled dynasties, enslaved millions, and built the fortunes of some of the most respectable families in the West. This is the story of the opium poppy. Forget what you think you know about drug wars. The real story isn't just about shadowy cartels or desperate junkies in alleyways. It is a story of corporate boardrooms, of royal decrees, and of the terrifying greed that turned a flower into a weapon of mass destruction. From the burning summer palace in Beijing to the Rust Belt towns of America, we're going to trace the bloodline of the only flower that ever forced the world to its knees. Welcome to the historian's desk. If you believe history is the greatest story ever told, help us tell it. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more deep dives, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin. But before this flower became a monster, it was considered a god. Before it destroyed minds, it was the only thing that could heal them. So, how did humanity take a divine gift and turn it into a global curse? To understand how a flower can burn the world down, we must step away from the modern boardrooms and the cartels. We must go back before gunpowder, before steel, before writing. We must go back 6,000 years, to the stony soil of the Neolithic Mediterranean. Imagine the life of a farmer in the Stone Age. Your world is defined by a relentless, grinding physicality. Your hands are calloused from gripping flint axes. Your back is permanently bent from tilling the earth. Pain is not a temporary inconvenience. It is your constant companion. A toothache can kill you. A broken leg is a death sentence. Fear of predators, of starvation, of the cold, is the noise that never stops playing in your head. And then, one day, you find it. It isn't the most spectacular flower in the field. It droops, its head heavy, as if it is sleeping. But the magic isn't in the petals, it is in the pod. Maybe you saw a goat chew on it and watched as the animal stopped bleating, standing still in a strange, placid trance. Curiosity takes over. You take a flake of sharp flint and you make a shallow, precise incision into the green skin of the seed pod. Immediately, the plant bleeds. A thick, milky white latex oozes from the wound. It beads up on the surface, glistening under the sun. You watch as the air touches it, oxidizing the milk, turning it into a sticky, dark brown gum. You scrape it off with your thumb. You taste it. It is impossibly bitter. But when you swallow it, the miracle happens. The throbbing in your joints vanishes. The knot of anxiety in your chest unravels. The harsh, jagged edges of reality soften. The hunger pangs fade. For the first time in your life, there is silence. This was not a drug to get high. This was a survival tool. This was the milk of paradise. The Sumerians, the architects of the very first civilization between the Tigris and the Euphrates, did not fear this plant, they worshipped it. On clay tablets baked 5,000 years ago. They gave it a name that rings with a heartbreaking innocence, Hulgil, the joy plant. To them, it was a technology of the soul. In a world where the rivers flooded without warning and the gods were capricious and cruel, the joy plant was the only reliable mercy. Priests administered it in smoky temples to lower the veil between the human and the divine. It was a holy sacrament. But as the centuries ground on, the poppy flowed down the Nile River to Egypt, and there, the joy plant shed its religious robes and put on a doctor's apron. And this is where the story turns from mystical to clinical and deeply unsettling. Let's zoom in on the city of Thebes. 1550 BCE, the capital of the poppy trade. The doctors here are writing the Ebers Papyrus, a scroll of medical wisdom. They aren't just treating priests anymore, they are treating everyone. Picture a small mud brick home in the shadow of the pyramids. Inside, a young mother is at her breaking point. Her infant has been screaming for 3 days with the agony of teething. There is no Tylenol, there is no anesthesia, there is only the noise and the heat and the exhaustion. She reaches for a small clay jar. Inside is a dark syrup, a mixture of fly dung, yes, fly dung, and fresh opium. She dips her finger in the black liquid. She rubs it on the baby's gums. 1 minute passes. 2. The screaming stops. The baby's eyes roll back, heavy and lidded. The breathing slows. A profound, unnatural stillness fills the room. The Egyptian doctors called this a remedy to prevent the excessive crying of children. We might call it chemical subjugation. How many of those children, sedated by the milk of paradise, simply drifted away in the night, their small lungs forgetting to take the next breath? History does not count them. It only records that the remedy worked. By the time the Roman Empire conquered the world, the poppy had completed its first transformation. It was no longer a sacred mystery. It was a commodity. It was the Roman equivalent of aspirin, stocked in every apothecary from Britannia to Syria. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic philosopher who wrote about enduring pain with the mind, couldn't endure his own life without it. He took a daily dose of theriac, a high-grade opium paste, to manage his stomach pains and the crushing weight of ruling the world. Galen, the most famous doctor of antiquity, wrote that opium was the strongest of the remedies. It cured headaches, epilepsy, sadness, and vertigo. It was the duct tape of ancient medicine. If something hurts, opium. If something is broken, opium. But here is the question you must ask. If the ancient world was awash in opium for thousands of years, if emperors ate it and babies were weaned on it, why didn't their civilization collapse into a junky nightmare? Why didn't Rome look like the Kensington Avenue zombie walks of Philadelphia? The answer lies in biology. And it is the key to everything that follows. For 5 millennia, from the Stone Age farmer to Marcus Aurelius, human beings almost exclusively ate or drank opium. When you swallow raw opium, it has to run a gauntlet. It goes into your stomach, where acids attack it. Then it goes to your liver. The liver is the body's bouncer. It filters out toxins. It breaks down the morphine before it can reach the blood. It releases the drug into your system slowly, over hours. The high is a gentle wave, not a tsunami. The addiction is a slow creep, a monkey on your back that grows heavy over years, not days. The body had a defense mechanism. The liver was our shield, but the poppy is patient. It was waiting for a partner. In the 16th century, the ships of the Age of Discovery would bring back a strange, leafy plant from the Americas, a plant that was meant to be burned and inhaled. Tobacco, somewhere in China. A forgotten innovator was about to make a fatal connection. They would ask a simple question. What happens if we stop eating the poppy and start smoking it? That single question would bypass the liver. It would smash the body's defences. It would take the milk of paradise and turn it into a weapon that could bring the mightiest empire on earth to its knees. The shield was about to break. The turning point in our story does not begin with a British warship. It begins with a Spanish galleon. In the late 16th century, European sailors crossing the Pacific brought a strange new gift from the Americas to the coast of China. It was a leafy plant, pungent and dry, tobacco. The Chinese took to smoking with an intensity that startled the world. It spread like wildfire, from the rough docks of the south all the way to the imperial court in Beijing. It became so pervasive, so distracting, that the last emperor of the Ming dynasty, Chongzhen, panicked. In 1639 he issued a desperate edict, a total ban on the sale and consumption of tobacco. It was a classic act of prohibition, and like almost every prohibition in human history, it backfired spectacularly. The ban didn't stop the smoking, it just drove it underground, and in the shadows of the black market, merchants began to experiment, to stretch their dwindling supplies of tobacco, or perhaps to mask its smell from the authorities. They started mixing it with other things. They tried arsenic, they tried hemp, but then they tried mixing the tobacco with the dissolved gum of the poppy. They called this mixture maddock. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. This was the chemical revolution, you see. For thousands of years, the liver had been humanity's guardian. When you ate opium, the liver filtered it, breaking it down, ensuring that only a fraction of the drug reached your brain over a period of hours. It was a slow, manageable intoxication, but the lungs have no guardian. When a smoker inhaled the vapour of maddock, the alkaloids bypassed the liver entirely. They entered the bloodstream through the vast, delicate surface area of the lungs and hit the brain in roughly 7 seconds. The result wasn't a gentle drift into sleep. It was a sledgehammer of euphoria. It was a rush, sudden, intense, and overwhelming. By changing the delivery system, these anonymous merchants had accidentally maximized the addictive potential of the poppy. They had turned a medicine into a neurological prison over the next century. The technology of addiction evolved. The tobacco was discarded as an unnecessary filler. Devotees learned to boil raw opium, skimming off the impurities until they were left with a thick, treacly paste called chandu. This was pure, concentrated ruin. To consume chandu required a new set of rituals, a new liturgy for the damned. Picture the scene in an 18th century opium den in Canton. It is not the chaotic, violent crack house of modern cinema. It is quiet. It is dim. It smells sweet, like caramelized sugar and rotting flowers. A patron enters. He lies down on a wooden platform, resting his head on a hard porcelain pillow. He takes up the pipe, a long bamboo tube with a ceramic bowl. He does not light it with a match. That would be too crude. He takes a long needle, dips it into the black paste, and spins it until he has a tiny bead, no larger than a pea. He holds this bead over the flame of a small oil lamp. It sizzles, it swells, it bubbles like living tar. With the precision of a surgeon, he inserts the hot bead into the tiny hole of the pipe bowl and inhales. One long, deep breath. The vapour fills him. The pain of the world, the debts, the failing harvest, the nagging wife, the corrupt officials. It all dissolves. He is not asleep, but he's not awake. He is drifting in a golden haze of apathy. This apathy was more dangerous to China than any invading army. The infection started at the bottom, with the coolies and the sailors, but it crept upward with terrifying speed. Soldiers smoke to forget the boredom of garrison duty. Merchants smoke to grease the wheels of business, but most alarming of all, the scholars and the mandarins, the very moral backbone of the empire, began to smoke. These were men who had spent their lives memorizing the Confucian classics, learning that duty to the family and the state was the highest virtue. Now, they lay on their sides for days, abandoning their posts, their minds untethered from reality. The Qing dynasty was not blind to this. They saw their society hollowing out. The Emperor Yongzheng, a stern and capable ruler, recognized the existential threat early on. In 1729, he issued the first imperial edict specifically targeting opium, banning the sale of the drug and the operation of smoking dens. The penalty for selling was strangulation. The penalty for using was the kange, a heavy wooden collar locked around the neck, a badge of public shame. It should have worked. The emperor's word was law. But here is where we see the other villain of our story. Not the foreign devil, but the domestic parasite, corruption. The trade was simply too profitable. The imperial edict clashed with the economic reality of the local magistrates. These officials were underpaid and overworked. When a smuggler offered a bribe that equaled 10 years of a magistrate's salary, the law evaporated. Instead of stopping the trade, the government officials became the silent partners. They didn't just turn a blind eye, they facilitated it. Smugglers developed fast. Nimble boats called fast crabs and scrambling dragons. Dozens of rowers powering through the coastal waters, heavily armed, outrunning the clumsy customs junks, and often the officials meant to catch them were waiting on the shore to take their cut. By the late 18th century, China had a festering, self-inflicted wound. It was a crisis of addiction and corruption, but it was still, largely, a domestic tragedy. The supply was limited. The opium was mostly homegrown or imported in small trickles from tributary states. But a predator was watching from the sea. The British East India Company had arrived on the coast. They were facing a catastrophic economic problem of their own. They were addicted to tea, and they were bleeding silver. They looked at China's open wound, and they didn't see a tragedy. They saw a market. They saw a way to get their silver back. The smoker's curse was about to meet the merchant's greed, and the combination would turn a local sickness into a global war. The catastrophe that was about to befall China did not start with a bang. It started with a sip. In the drawing rooms of London, Bath, and Manchester, the British public had developed an insatiable addiction of their own. It wasn't to a drug, but to a leaf, tea. By the late 18th century, tea had become the lifeblood of the British Empire. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, the warm comfort of the poor, and the social currency of the rich. But there was a problem, a simple, ruinous, economic problem. The tea came from China, and the Chinese Empire had absolutely no interest in buying anything Britain had to sell. British merchants tried to sell them heavy woolen cloth. The Chinese, living in a humid climate or wearing fine silks, politely declined. They tried to sell metal trinkets and clocks. The Chinese emperor, ruling the Middle Kingdom, viewed these as amusing toys, nothing more. The Chinese demanded payment in the only currency they respected, silver, for decades. Ships left British ports laden with silver bullion and returned with crates of tea. It was a massive, one-way hemorrhage of wealth. The British treasury was bleeding dry. The empire faced a stark choice: stop drinking tea, which was unthinkable, or find a product, any product, that the Chinese could not refuse. They needed something addictive, and just across the Himalayas, in the scorching, fertile fields of Bengal, the solution was waiting. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the British East India Company had ceased to be a mere trading firm. They had conquered Bengal, becoming the de facto rulers of a territory larger and richer than England itself. With this conquest, they gained control of the prime agricultural land of India. The company, a corporate entity with its own army and its own flag, looked at this land and made a cold, calculated decision. They would turn Bengal into the world's largest drug factory. They established a monopoly that was total and ruthless. They didn't just tax the poppy, they engineered it. Company agents would go to local Indian farmers, men who had grown rice and vegetables for generations, and force a cash advance into their hands. It looked like a loan. It was actually a trap. Once a farmer took the money, he was legally bound to grow poppies. If the crop failed, he went into debt. If he tried to quit, he was ruined. It was debt peonage, a system of slavery in all but name, designed to ensure a ceaseless supply of raw material. At harvest time, the landscape of Bengal was transformed. Thousands of workers scraped the sticky latex from millions of pods. This raw gum was carted to the company's massive factories in Patna and Benares. This wasn't the artisanal opium of the ancient world. This was industrial chemistry. Inside the factories, the opium was tested for purity, mixed, and processed into standardized, dense cakes, each weighing exactly 3 pounds. These cakes were stamped with the company seal, wrapped in poppy petals, and packed into heavy wooden chests. Each chest held 40 cakes. They created a brand. Patna and Malwa opium became the gold standard, as recognizable to a 19th century addict as a pack of Marlboros is to a smoker today. It was high grade, reliable, and incredibly potent. But here lies the true genius and the true darkness of the British scheme. The East India Company knew that selling opium to China was illegal. The Qing emperors had banned it. To sail a company ship into Canton flying the Union Jack and unload tons of narcotics would be an act of war. And it would stain the honour of the British Crown. So, they invented the world's first system of plausible deniability. The company didn't ship the drugs, they simply held auctions. Picture the scene in Kolkata, a grand hall, filled with the smoke of cigars and the murmur of wealthy men. The company auctioneers stood at the podium and sold the chests to private merchants. The country traders, men like William Jardine and James Matheson. The company took the cash and handed over the opium. Their official stance was breathtakingly cynical. We're merely selling an agricultural product in India. What these gentlemen do with it after it leaves our warehouse is entirely their business. Of course. Everyone knew their business was smuggling. These private traders loaded the chests onto fast, nimble ships called clippers, raced to the Chinese coast, and sold the drug to corrupt local smugglers. The illicit silver earned from the opium was then handed back to the East India Company in Canton to buy tea. The loop was closed. The silver that flowed out of London to buy tea was replaced by silver flowing out of China to buy opium. The British public got their tea, the company got their profit, the Indian farmer got debt, and China got the plague. It was a triangle of greed, a perfect self-sustaining engine of addiction. By the 1830s, the flow of silver had reversed. China was no longer draining the world's wealth. It was being bled dry. The economy was destabilizing. The army was intoxicated. The bureaucracy was corrupted. In the Forbidden City, the Daoguang Emperor looked at the reports piling up on his desk. He realized that this wasn't just a trade dispute. It was an existential threat. His empire was dying. He had tried prohibition. He had tried mercy. Now he would try force. He looked through the ranks of his officials. searching for a man who could not be bribed, a man who feared no one but history, he found Lin Zexu. And as Commissioner Lin packed his bags for Canton, the collision between the immovable object of Chinese pride and the unstoppable force of British greed became inevitable. The time for business was over. The time for fire had begun. In the spring of 1839, a man arrived in Canton who could not be bought. His name was Lin Zexu. To the corrupt local magistrates, he was a nightmare. To the opium smugglers, he was a nuisance. But to history, he is the tragic conscience of a dying empire. Lin was a scholar official of the highest order, a man known by the nickname Blue Sky, meaning his integrity was as clear and vast as the heavens. The Daoguang Emperor had sent him south with a single, impossible mandate: cut out the cancer, stop the opium trade. When Lin stepped off his sedan chair in Canton, the foreign merchants in the 13 Factories district barely looked up from their ledgers. They were used to Chinese officials. They knew the game. An official would arrive, bluster about the emperor's wrath, accept a heavy bag of silver coins under the table, and then write a report saying the problem was solved. Business would continue as usual, but Lin Zexu didn't want their silver. He started by cleaning his own house. In a matter of weeks, his agents swept through the city, arresting over 1,600 Chinese dealers and users. He confiscated thousands of pipes. He forced addicts into crude rehabilitation clinics, tearing the drug from their hands. He showed the foreigners that this was not a performance. This was a purge. Then, he turned his eyes toward the river, where the British and American ships sat anchored, their bellies full of foreign mud. He issued a decree that struck the merchants like a thunderclap. He demanded they surrender every single ounce of opium in their possession. The British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, tried to haggle. He offered a token surrender of 1,000 chests, a bribe disguised as compliance. Lin laughed. He wasn't negotiating a business deal. He was enforcing the law of heaven. When the merchants refused to yield, Lin escalated. He didn't fire a shot, he simply stopped the clock. He surrounded the foreign district with troops. He pulled out all the Chinese servants, the cooks, the cleaners, the water carriers. He blockaded the supplies. For 6 weeks, the wealthiest traders in the world sat in their opulent warehouses, sweating, hungry, and terrified. They were hostages in their own counting houses. Finally, Captain Elliot broke. He had no choice. He ordered the merchants to surrender their stock, promising that the British government, the Crown itself, would reimburse them. It was a total capitulation. Over the next few weeks, the chests were brought ashore. 2,283 of them. That is over £2.5 million of opium. In today's terms, the street value was astronomical. Over $300 million, Lin Zexu now possessed the mountain of poison that had been killing his people. He could have sold it to fund the state. He could have stockpiled it. Instead, he chose to perform the greatest act of drug enforcement in human history. He ordered 3 massive trenches dug on the beach at Human. He didn't just burn the opium. Burning it would have intoxicated the whole city with the smoke. He used chemistry. Workers broke open the chests and threw the sticky black balls into the trenches. They flooded the pits with seawater. Then they added lime. The chemical reaction was violent. The water boiled and hissed. The lime ate into the opium, dissolving the alkaloids, turning the precious patna and malwa cakes into a churning, noxious slurry of useless sludge for 23 days. Lin stood on the beach and watched. He invited foreign observers to witness it. He wanted them to see that China was not weak, that it could wash away its shame when the reaction was finished. He opened the sluice gates, and the toxic tide washed out into the South China Sea. But Lin Zexu made one fatal miscalculation. He believed he was dealing with civilized men. He believed that if he could just appeal to the morality of the British ruler, the trade would stop in his study. By the light of an oil lamp, he composed a letter to Queen Victoria. It is one of the most poignant documents in diplomatic history. He wrote, "Where is your conscience? I have heard that the smoking for opium is very strictly forbidden by your country, since it is not permitted to do harm to your own country. Then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries." He appealed to her as a sovereign, assuming she simply didn't know what her merchants were doing. The letter never reached her. It died in the bureaucratic machinery of the Foreign Office, and even if she had read it, it wouldn't have mattered. Lin thought he had won a moral victory. He thought he had cleansed the empire, but as he watched the sludge flow into the ocean, he didn't realize he was actually watching the fuse burn down on a bomb. Captain Elliot had made the British government liable for the lost opium. The debate in London wasn't about morality. It was about property. It was about national honour. Lin Zexu had just destroyed British property. He had insulted the Crown, and the response would not be a letter of apology. It would be the most terrifying fleet of the warships the world had ever seen, steaming toward the Pearl River with their gun ports open. The Incorruptible had done his duty, and in doing so, he had doomed his nation. When the British response finally arrived in the summer of 1840, it did not look like honour. It looked like a machine. The Qing dynasty had prepared for a war of men. They had mobilised their banners, elite troops with matchlock muskets, spears, and bows. They had fortified their rivers with wooden war junks and stone forts, believing that any invader would have to sail with the wind, following the predictable rhythms of nature. But the British didn't bring just soldiers. They brought the Industrial Revolution. Leading the fleet was a creature unlike anything the Chinese had ever seen. It was the Nemesis. It wasn't a majestic ship of the line with billowing white sails. It was a flat-bottomed, iron-hulled monster, powered by steam, with massive paddle wheels churning the water like a thrashing beast. It belched thick, black smoke that darkened the sky. To the villagers watching from the banks of the Pearl River, it must have looked like a demon. The Nemesis broke all the rules of naval warfare. It had a draft of less than 6 feet. This meant it didn't need deep water. It could glide over sandbars and mudflats, sailing straight up the shallow rivers into the heart of the country, appearing where no heavy ship should ever be able to go. The collision between these two worlds was not a battle, it was an execution. In one engagement, 15 Chinese war junks, proud, wooden vessels brightly painted with dragon eyes to ward off evil spirits, sailed out to meet a single British steamer. The Chinese fired their cannons, the iron balls struck the hull of the steamer and simply bounced off. Clang, clang. The steamer didn't even turn. It just swiveled its guns and unleashed explosive shells. Technology the Chinese had never encountered. One by one, the junks were splintered into matchwood. The water turned red. The Nemesis didn't just defeat the Chinese navy. It rendered it obsolete in an afternoon. The British didn't stop at the coast. They pushed up the Yangtze River, the artery of the empire, striking at the city of Qingqiang, Zhenjiang, in 1842. This was the bottleneck of the Grand Canal, the lifeline that carried grain to Beijing. If Qingqiang fell, the capital would starve. The fighting here was brutal. The Manchu garrison, realizing their bows and antiquated muskets were useless against percussion cap rifles that fired in the rain, fought with suicidal desperation. They didn't surrender. They burned their own homes. They killed their own families to save them from capture. The Manchu general, seeing the British flag rising over the city walls, walked calmly back to his headquarters. He didn't run. He sat in his chair, piled wood around him, and ordered his servants to light the fire. He burned himself alive rather than submit to the barbarians. That smoke signalled the end. The Daoguang emperor, his capital threatened and his military shattered, had no choice. He sued for peace. On August 29, 1842, the final act of this tragedy took place aboard the British flagship, HMS Cornwallis, anchored off Nanjing. The atmosphere in the grand cabin was suffocating. The British officers stood in tight, sweat-drenched wool uniforms, exuding the arrogance of absolute victory. Across from them sat the imperial commissioners, Qing and Yilabu in their silk robes, looking like men attending their own funeral. The document on the table, the Treaty of Nanking, was not an agreement between equals. It was an invoice. First, the money. China was forced to pay 21 million silver dollars. 6 million of that was to pay for the opium Linzexu had destroyed. Think about that. The British government forced China to pay for the drugs they had legally confiscated. They also had to pay for the cost of the war itself. China was paying for its own invasion. Second, the access. The old system of containing foreigners to Canton was smashed. 5 treaty ports, including Shanghai, were thrown open to British residents and trade. Third, the insult. The treaty established extraterritoriality. This meant that if a British subject committed a crime on Chinese soil, rape, murder, theft, they could not be tried by a Chinese judge. They answered only to British law. It was a declaration that Chinese justice was inferior, that their sovereignty ended the moment a white man stepped ashore. And finally, the land. The British demanded a base. They pointed to a barren, rocky island off the southern coast. It was a haven for pirates and fishermen, insignificant to the emperor. He ceded it in perpetuity. That rock was Hong Kong. The Treaty of Nanking was the first of what history calls the unequal treaties. It marked the beginning of China's century of humiliation. But notice what was missing from the document. Nowhere in the treaty did it say the word opium. The British were too polite to write it down. They didn't need to. The guns had done the talking, the ports were open, the officials were cowed, and the drug that had started the war could now flow into China like a dark tide, unopposed and unmentioned. The emperor had lost the war of iron versus wood. But the British had lost something too. Though they didn't know it yet, they had lost the moral high ground forever. They had become the drug pushers of the world. And they had just acquired a new distribution centre called Hong Kong. The Treaty of Nanking was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it brought a decade of festering resentment. The British looked at their new treaty ports and saw them not as a victory, but as a disappointment. They were greedy. They wanted more. They wanted access to the vast interior of China. They wanted a permanent ambassador in Beijing. And most of all, they wanted the opium trade fully, explicitly legalized. The Qing dynasty, meanwhile, was slowly bleeding to death. The silver drain continued. The addiction rate soared. And now, they were fighting a massive internal civil war, the Taiping Rebellion, that was tearing the country apart in the world of empires. An open wound is not an invitation to heal. It is an invitation to press harder. By 1856, the British were looking for an excuse to kick down the door again. They found it in a pirate ship. It was a small, insignificant vessel called the Arrow. It was Chinese-owned and Chinese-crewed, but it had a dubious registration in Hong Kong. When Chinese officials boarded it in Canton to arrest the crew for piracy, the British consul, Harry Parkes, screamed bloody murder. He claimed the ship had been flying the British flag and that the Chinese had insulted the crown. It was a lie. The registration had expired. The flag likely wasn't even flying. But in the grand game of imperialism, truth is just a nuisance. The insult was manufactured, and the dogs of war were unleashed, this time. The British brought a friend. France, under Napoleon III, wanted its own slice of glory. They found their own flimsy pretext, the execution of a French missionary, Father Auguste Chapdelaine, who had been preaching illegally in the interior. So, an Anglo-French alliance, two ancient rivals united by greed, sailed north. This was the Second Opium War. And if the First War was a tragedy, this one would be a desecration. The Allied forces were ruthless. They seized Canton. They smashed the Taku forts guarding the river to Beijing. By 1860, the foreign armies were marching on the capital itself. The Jianfeng Emperor, terrified and indecisive, fled the city, leaving his court to face the wrath of the invaders. But before the final blow, something happened that turned the war personal. A British diplomatic delegation, led by Harry Parkes, went ahead to negotiate. They were captured by the Qing, and the Qing, desperate and furious, did not treat them as diplomats. They were thrown into prison and tortured. Several died in agony. When the British High Commissioner, Lord Elgin, heard this, he went cold. Lord Elgin was a man of high culture. He was the son of the man who had taken the famous marbles from the Parthenon in Athens. He believed himself to be a civilized gentleman, but when he saw the bodies of his countrymen, he decided that the emperor needed to be taught a lesson that would scar the Chinese soul for eternity. He didn't want to burn the Forbidden City. That would be too political. He wanted to destroy something personal. Just northwest of Beijing lay the Yuanming Yuan, the Gardens of Perfect Brightness, known to the West as the Old Summer Palace. This wasn't just a building. It was a dream made real. Covering 3 hectares, it was a wonderland of man-made lakes, hills, and over 200 pavilions. It housed the greatest collection of art in Chinese history, ancient jade, priceless porcelain, and libraries of unique manuscripts. It even featured European-style palaces designed by Jesuit missionaries, complete with Baroque fountains. It was the heart of the dynasty. And Lord Elgin decided to cut it out. First came the looting. French and British soldiers rushed into the paradise like wolves. It was a frenzy of greed. They used rifle butts to smash open intricate cabinets. They stuffed their pockets with gems. Officers claimed the finest vases for themselves. One captain described soldiers dressing up in the Empress's silk robes, laughing as they smashed mirrors and drank the Emperor's private wine. But looting wasn't enough for Elgin. He wanted erasure. On October 18, 1860, he gave the order. 300 British troops marched into the gardens. They didn't carry guns. They carried torches. They set the palaces on fire. For 3 days and 3 nights, the Gardens of Perfect Brightness burned. The cedar wood structures exploded into flames. The heat was so intense it cracked the marble stones. Thick, black smoke rose into the sky, blotting out the sun over Beijing. raining ash down on the terrified citizens like black snow. Imagine the sound! The roar of the fire consuming centuries of history, the popping of ancient porcelain in the heat, the collapse of timber roofs, it was an act of cultural genocide. When the smoke finally cleared, only the stone skeletons of the European palaces remained, hollow, blackened ruins standing in a wasteland of ash. The message was received. The Qing court, broken and humiliated, signed the Convention of Peking. This time, there was no ambiguity. The treaty forced the emperor to pay massive indemnities. It allowed foreign ambassadors into Beijing. It opened the Yangtze River to foreign ships. And, in the cruelest clause of all, it officially legalized the opium trade. The war was over. The West had won. They had burned the most beautiful garden on earth to secure the right to sell poison. The smoke from the summer palace would eventually fade, but the memory of it would burn in the Chinese consciousness for 100 years, a constant reminder of the price of weakness. But while the British were busy burning palaces, another player was quietly counting their money in the background. They hadn't fired a shot, but they were about to take the profits home to build a new empire of their own. The Americans were coming. When we think of the Opium Wars, we usually picture a British villain twirling his moustache. We think of Queen Victoria and the Union Jack. But there is another flag in this story, a flag that has been conveniently scrubbed from the popular history books. While the British were blasting open the gates of China with cannons, the Americans were slipping through the back door with a smile. They were not empire builders, they were businessmen. And they were about to prove that in the drug trade. A Yankee ledger can be just as deadly as a British gunboat. To understand the scale of this American hypocrisy, we have to look at one of the most famous faces in American history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The man who led the US through World War II, the champion of freedom. Where did his middle name, Delano, come from? It came from his grandfather, Warren Delano Jr., and Warren Delano Jr. was not a freedom fighter. He was a senior partner in Russell & Company, the largest American drug trafficking organization in China. The Americans arrived late to the party. The British already controlled the Indian poppy fields. So, the American merchants, hailing from the polite puritanical society of Boston, had to be creative. They couldn't buy Indian opium, so they went to Turkey. They bought Smyrna opium, a high-quality product grown in the Ottoman Empire, and to get it to China. They didn't use clunky warships. They built something new, the clipper ship, ships like the Sea Witch. These were the Ferraris of the 19th century ocean, sleek, narrow, and incredibly fast. They could outrun the British Navy and the Chinese patrols. They raced across the ocean, carrying chests of Turkish poison to the floating warehouses at Linton Island. The men running this trade weren't gangsters. They were the Boston Brahmins, the aristocracy of New England, the Forbes family, the Perkins family, the Peabodys. These are names that today adorn the libraries of Ivy League universities and the wings of prestigious hospitals. John Murray Forbes, a legendary figure in American finance, started his career as a drug runner for Russell & Company. He used his drug profits to return to America and invest in a new technology called the railroad. The tracks that built the modern American economy were laid, in part, with money laundered from the destruction of Chinese lives. But the most chilling part is not the crime, it is the justification. Warren Delano Jr. was a man of high social standing. He went to church, he donated to charity, and when asked about his business, he didn't apologize. He wrote home that he considered the opium trade to be fair, honorable, and legitimate. He compared it to selling wine or brandy. It was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. In Boston, they were gentlemen. In Canton, they were pushers. They viewed the Chinese prohibition laws not as a moral stance, but as an annoying barrier to free trade that had to be circumvented. During the First Opium War, the Americans played a cynical double game. Officially, the United States was neutral, but while the British ships were busy fighting the Chinese Navy, the American ships happily swooped in and took over the British customers. They profited from the war without firing a shot. They grew fabulously wealthy. They returned to Massachusetts and built mansions on the coast. They whitewashed their money so thoroughly that within a generation, no one remembered the smell of the opium chests, but history has a sense of irony. You cannot export poison forever without some of it blowing back in your face. In the mid-19th century, the United States began to build the Transcontinental Railroad. To do the back-breaking work of blasting tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, they hired thousands of Chinese labourers, men fleeing the chaos and poverty of a homeland that has been shattered by the Opium Wars. These men brought their culture, their food, and their pipes. In the shadows of the work camps and the emerging Chinatowns of San Francisco, the opium den appeared on American soil, suddenly. The drug wasn't a distant commodity making money for the Forbes family. It was here. White Americans began to visit the dens. Gamblers, prostitutes, and then, slowly, everyday citizens, the American elite, the very class of people whose ancestors had grown rich selling the drug to China, now recoiled in horror. They didn't blame the traders, they blamed the victims. They painted the Chinese immigrants as deviant corruptors bringing a heathen vice to Christian America. This moral panic fueled the first anti-drug laws in the US, laws that were explicitly racist, targeting the Chinese practice of smoking while ignoring the white practice of drinking laudanum. The Brahmin smugglers had successfully imported the silver of China to build their railroads, but they had also imported the ghost of the poppy, and unlike the railroads, this ghost would not stay on the tracks. It was about to enter the American living room, disguised as medicine. While the Americans were building railroads and the British were burning palaces, the ghost of the poppy had found a new place to hide. It wasn't in a dark, smoke-filled den in Shanghai. It wasn't in a smuggler's cargo hold. It was in the most respectable place on earth, the Victorian parlour. Picture a mantelpiece in London, or perhaps Boston, in 1860. There is a family Bible, a daguerreotype of a stern ancestor, and right next to them, sitting in the open, is a small glass bottle. It looks innocent. It smells faintly of alcohol and spices, maybe cinnamon or saffron. It was called laudanum, and for the 19th century, this was the angel in the bottle. Laudanum was not a secret vice. It was the aspirin, the Prozac, and the Valium of its day, all rolled into one. The recipe was deceptively simple. Opium dissolved in alcohol. You didn't need a prescription to buy it. You didn't need to meet a shady character in an alley. You walked into the corner chemist or the local grocer and bought it for pennies. It was cheaper than gin, and to the suffering masses of the Industrial Revolution, it was more reliable than prayer. But the true horror of laudanum isn't that adults were using it, it's who else was using it. Let's go to the slums of Manchester. The air is thick with coal smoke. A young mother works 14-hour shifts in a textile mill. She has no childcare. She has a screaming infant who is hungry, teething, or sick with dysentery. She loves her child, but she is desperate for sleep. She needs the baby to be quiet so she can work, so they don't starve. So, she reaches for a bottle with a comforting name, Godfrey's Cordial, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, mother's quietness. She puts a few drops of the dark syrup on a sugar lump and feeds it to the baby. The effect is magical. The crying stops. The baby goes limp and drifts into a deep, heavy slumber. The mother goes to work, relieved, but often. She returns to find the baby hasn't moved. The dose was too strong. Or perhaps the cumulative effect of daily dosing caused the infant's respiratory system to simply stop. The Victorian records are full of infant deaths listed as debility from birth or maternal overlay, a polite way of saying the mother rolled over on the child in her sleep. But historians know the truth. Thousands of these children were victims of unintended overdose. They were a generation quieted to death by the poppy. But laudanum didn't just kill the poor, it enslaved the rich. In the upper-class drawing rooms, women were living in a different kind of prison. They were corseted, restricted, and bored. If a woman expressed frustration, anxiety, or depression, she wasn't listened to, she was diagnosed. The doctors called it hysteria or neurasthenia. The cure, a few drops of laudanum. It was the chemical corset for the female mind. It smoothed out the edges of a rigid society. It made women placid, serene, and untroubled. The ideal Victorian wife, angelic and quiet, was often a woman maintaining a low-grade, perpetual opioid buzz. And then there were the artists. The poppy has always had a seductive relationship with creativity. The Romantic poets didn't just use opium, they glamorized it. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote his famous poem Kubla Khan after waking from an opium-induced dream. Thomas de Quincey wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, turning addiction into a gothic adventure of celestial dreams and hellish nightmares. They made the drug sound profound. They stripped away the medical pretense and revealed the dark, psychological ocean beneath. They were the rock stars of their day, and they made addiction look like a tragic, romantic destiny. But in the 1850s, a new invention changed the game again. It stripped away the romance and replaced it with cold, hard efficiency, the hypodermic syringe. Before this, you had to drink the opium or smoke it. Now, doctors could isolate the active ingredient, morphine, discovered earlier in the century, and shoot it directly into the bloodstream. It was hailed as a miracle. Doctors believed that by bypassing the stomach, they would bypass the addiction. They were wrong. They had simply created a faster highway to the brain. This new technology met its perfect match in the American Civil War. On the battlefields of Antietam and Gettysburg, tens of thousands of young men were having limbs sawed off in field hospitals. The screaming was unbearable. To show mercy, doctors injected them with morphine. It worked. It killed the pain. But when the war ended and the soldiers limped home, they brought something back with them. They were pale, gaunt, and desperate. They suffered from a mysterious affliction the public called soldier's disease. It was opioid addiction on a mass scale. By the late 19th century, the medical community finally woke up. The angel in the bottle had become a demon. The innocent syrup was a killer. The miracle injection was a trap. Doctors were desperate. They had created a crisis, and they needed a way out. They needed a new drug, something as powerful as morphine, but safe, something non-addictive. And in 1898, in a pristine laboratory in Germany, a company called Bayer believed they had found it. They didn't just find a drug. They found a hero. The year is 1897. We are in Elberfeld, Germany, inside the brick-walled fortress of Friedrich Bayer and Company. The air here smells of coal dust and acrid chemicals, but the mood is electric. This is the golden age of German chemistry. There is a belief, bordering on religious faith, that science can solve anything, that there is no pain nature can inflict that a German chemist cannot cure with a test tube. In a quiet corner of the laboratory stands a young man named Felix Hoffmann. He is not a mad scientist. He is a dutiful son. His father suffers from crippling rheumatism, and the standard treatments are toxic. Hoffmann is looking for something better, and he finds it. He synthesizes a stable form of acetyl salicylic acid. The world will come to know it as aspirin. It is a monumental triumph. It will go on to save millions of lives and ease the headaches of billions. But Hoffmann isn't done, buoyed by his success. He turns his attention to a much darker problem. The medical world is facing a crisis. Morphine, the soldier's medicine, has turned into a monster. Doctors are desperate for a holy grail, a painkiller as powerful as morphine, but without the addiction, a drug that can stop pain without enslaving the soul. There is also another killer stalking the streets of Europe, tuberculosis. It is a disease of suffocation. Patients cough until their ribs fracture, until they bleed. Doctors need a cough suppressant powerful enough to silence those lungs. Hoffmann goes back to his bench. He looks at the morphine molecule. He wonders, if I treat this molecule with the same chemical process I use for aspirin, acetylation, what happens? He mixes morphine with acetic anhydride. He cooks it, and he produces a new, white, crystalline powder. His boss, Heinrich Drieser, the head of Bayer's pharmacology lab, decides to test it, not on rats first, but on the factory workers. The workers take the powder, and then they smile. They report that their coughs have vanished, but more than that, they feel wonderful. They don't just feel pain-free, they feel powerful, they feel uplifted, they feel heroic. Dresser is ecstatic. He believes he has found the miracle. Based on these initial flimsy tests, he makes a claim that will go down as the most catastrophic error in medical history. He announces that this new drug, diacetyl morphine, is non-addictive. In fact, he goes further. He claims it is a cure for morphine addiction. The logic is seductive. We will use this safe, new drug to wean the soldiers off the dangerous old one. They need a name for the market. They take the worker's description, heroic, and brand it, heroin. In 1898, Bayer launches a global blitz. It is the pharmaceutical equivalent of the iPhone launch. Heroin is everywhere. It is sold in liquid syrup for coughs. It is pressed into pills. It comes in cute little glass bottles stamped with the famous Bayer cross. Advertisements in medical journals recommend it for everything. Asthma, bronchitis, stomach cancer, and even schizophrenia. Doctors, trusting the prestigious German science, embrace it. They hand it out to crying babies. They give it to the elderly. They give it to the morphine addicts, believing they're saving them. For a few years, it seems to work. The coughing stops. The patients are happy. But then, the letters start arriving at Bayer's headquarters. Doctors are confused. Their patients aren't getting better. They are coming back, begging for more. They are developing a tolerance that is terrifyingly rapid, and when the doctors try to cut them off, the patients don't just get grumpy. They descend into a hell of withdrawal that makes morphine sickness look like a mild flu. Agony, vomiting, a craving so intense it overrides every human instinct. The chemists go back to the chalkboard, and slowly, the horrifying truth of the chemistry reveals itself. Hoffman hadn't weakened the morphine molecule. He had supercharged it by adding those two acetyl groups. He had made the molecule more fat-soluble. This meant it could slip through the blood-brain barrier, the brain's natural defense wall, much faster than morphine. Once it was inside the brain, the body's enzymes stripped the acetyl groups away. Do you understand what that means? It means the drug converts back into morphine the moment it hits the brain. But because it crossed the barrier so fast, it delivers a massive, instantaneous flood of dopamine. Bayer hadn't created a cure. They'd created a chemical Trojan horse. Heroin was simply a high-velocity delivery system for morphine. It was the difference between sipping a beer and injecting pure ethanol. By the early 1900s, the Bayer miracle was a global disaster. Hospitals in New York and London reported a surge of heroinism. The people addicted weren't just the old soldiers anymore. They were teenagers. They were factory girls. They were the very people the drug was supposed to save. Bayer quietly ceased production in 1913. They tried to bury the mistake. But you cannot uninvent a molecule. The formula was out. The genie had escaped the bottle, and this time it was wearing a lab coat. The age of the plant was ending. The age of the chemical had begun. And as the world marched toward the First World War, the poppy was no longer just a flower in a field. It was a white powder in a syringe, waiting for the trenches. The First World War shattered the old order. The Second World War finished the job. By the late 1940s, the great colonial empires, the British in Burma, the French in Indochina, were packing their bags. They left behind a power vacuum. They left behind lines drawn on maps that meant nothing to the people living there. And in the rugged, mist-shrouded mountains where the borders of Burma, Thailand, and Laos collide, something new began to grow in that vacuum. It was a place that didn't technically exist, a geographer's nightmare of jungle peaks and lawless valleys. History would give it a name that sounds like a fable, the Golden Triangle. But the architects of this kingdom weren't local farmers. They were the casualties of a different war. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists swept to victory in China. The opposing nationalist army, the Kuomintang KMT, was shattered. But one unit, the lost army of the 93rd Division, refused to surrender. They retreated south, crossing the border into the wild Shan state of Burma. They were stranded, they were starving, and they were armed. Enter the Central Intelligence Agency in Washington. The fear of Red China was absolute. The CIA looked at this ragtag army of anti-communist zealots sitting on China's southern border and saw a weapon. They decided to support them. Operation Paper was born. The CIA flew in weapons, radios, and advisors. They wanted the KMT to be a thorn in Mao's side. But there was a problem. A ghost army is expensive. They need food, uniforms, and salaries. The CIA's funding was a trickle, but the KMT needed a flood. The KMT commanders looked around them. The Shan Hills were covered in poppies. The local tribes had grown it for generations for medicine and ritual. The commanders were not moralists. They were desperate soldiers. They realized that if they organized this chaos, they could fund their war forever. They imposed a poppy tax on the farmers. They built refineries to turn raw opium into morphine base, and they organized massive mule caravans, hundreds of animals long, snaking through the jungle trails to Thailand. The CIA watched this happen, and they did nothing. In the cold calculus of the Cold War, fighting communism was the only thing that mattered. If their allies needed to sell drugs to fight the Reds, so be it. The Golden Triangle was born as a narco-state, underwritten by the American taxpayers' obsession with containment. But the story gets darker in the 1960s. The war expanded into Laos and Vietnam. The CIA began a secret war in Laos, recruiting the Hmong Hill tribes to fight the communist Pathet Lao to supply these remote fighters. The CIA used a proprietary airline, Air America. These pilots were the cowboys of the sky. They flew C-47s onto dirt strips cut into mountaintops. They dropped rice and rifles, but the planes couldn't fly back empty. The Hmong commanded by General Vang Pao had only one cash crop, opium. To keep the Hmong fighting, the CIA allowed, and sometimes facilitated, the transport of opium on Air America planes. It was a logistical masterpiece. The US intelligence apparatus provided the shipping network for the world's heroin supply. From this fertile chaos emerged the ultimate villain of the era, a man named Chang Chi-fu, better known to the world as Kun Sa. Kun Sa was half Shan, half Chinese, and fully ruthless. He wasn't just a smuggler. He was a CEO with a private army. He defeated the KMT remnants. He fought the Burmese government. He consolidated the Golden Triangle into a unified empire. He established his own capital at Homong. It wasn't a bandit camp. It was a city with schools, hospitals, hydroelectric power, and surface-to-air missiles protecting his heroin refineries. Kun Sa was a marketing genius. He invited journalists to his jungle fortress. He posed as a freedom fighter, claiming he only sold opium to feed his people and liberate the Shan state. He even made an audacious offer to the President of the United States. He offered to sell his entire opium harvest to the US government for a fixed price. "Buy it from me," he said, "and it won't end up on your streets." Washington declined. They called him the Prince of Death, but they couldn't stop him. Under Kun Sa, the chemistry changed. The primitive labs of the jungle started producing China White, number 4, heroin. It was 99% pure, a fine, white powder that could be injected. And here lies the most bitter irony of the Vietnam War. The United States sent 500,000 young men to fight communism in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and waiting for them in the bars and brothels of Saigon was the very product their own intelligence agency had helped incubate. Number 4, heroin was so cheap in Saigon, $2 a vial, that soldiers used it like cigarettes. It was pure enough to be smoked in tobacco, meaning you didn't need a needle to get hooked. By 1971, reports estimated that 10% to 15% of American enlisted men in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. The US Army wasn't just fighting the Viet Cong, it was fighting its own nervous system. The dragon had eaten its own tail. The warlord's kingdom in the Golden Triangle proved that you cannot use a monster to fight your enemies without that monster eventually turning on you. But empires are fickle. By the 1980s, the Golden Triangle began to fade. Law enforcement pressure increased. Routes were cut. The poppy, however, did not panic. It simply looked at the map and found a new home. A place even more rugged, even more ungovernable, and even more soaked in the blood of empires. It looked west, to Afghanistan. The flower is patient. It does not care about ideology. It does not care about borders. It simply waits for the soil to be watered with blood. And in 1979, the blood began to flow in the high, desolate peaks of Afghanistan for centuries. This land had been a footnote in the drug trade, a rugged crossroads where empires went to die. But on Christmas Eve, 1979, the Soviet Union made a fatal calculation. They rolled their tanks across the Amu Darya River to prop up a failing communist puppet government in Kabul. They thought it would be a police action instead. They walked into a buzzsaw. The Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, rose up in a holy war, a jihad. They were fierce, they were fragmented, and they were outgunned in Washington. The CIA saw the board set. They saw a chance to give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. They launched Operation Cyclone, one of the most expensive covert operations in history. Billions of dollars in Stinger missiles and AK-47s flowed through the CIA to Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, and then into the hands of the holy warriors. But here is the rule of insurgency. The CIA can give you a missile to shoot down a helicopter, but they don't pay your salary. A warlord needs cash. He needs to feed his fighters. He needs to bribe local elders. He needs a payroll. The Mujahideen commanders looked at the fertile Helmand River Valley. The war had destroyed the orchards and the wheat fields. You couldn't get a crate of pomegranates to market through a war zone. They would rot. But opium is perfect. It doesn't rot. It is lightweight. You can store it in a cave for 10 years and it only gets better. And the buyers, traffickers connected to the same networks moving the CIA's weapons, would come right to your farm with stacks of cash. So, the deal was struck. The CIA provided the weapons, the poppy provided the logistics. The Khyber Pass became a two-way highway of death. Trucks drove in from Pakistan loaded with American arms. They drove out loaded with raw opium gum. The scale of this transformation is hard to comprehend. Before the war, Afghanistan produced perhaps 100 tons of opium a year. By the time the Soviets retreated in humiliation a decade later, production had exploded to thousands of tons. The Golden Triangle was finished. Afghanistan was now the undisputed heavyweight champion, the Saudi Arabia of opium. But when the Soviets left in 1989, the peace did not come. The warlords, flush with drug money and American weapons, turned on each other. They tore Kabul apart. The country descended into anarchy from this chaos. A new force emerged from the religious schools, the madrasas, in the south. They were young, they were austere, and they were terrifying. They called themselves the Taliban. The students, they swept across the country with a promise of order, and their relationship with the poppy was a masterpiece of cynical pragmatism. Publicly, they declared drugs to be haram, forbidden by God. But privately, they realized they were sitting on a gold mine. They didn't ban the crop, they taxed it. They instituted the ushur, a 10% religious tax on the opium harvest. It was efficient, it was organized, it funded their conquest of 90% of the country. The Taliban became the world's first drug cartel to run a sovereign state. And then, in July 2000, something bizarre happened. Mullah Omar, the one-eyed leader of the Taliban, wanted international legitimacy. He wanted the world to recognize his government. So, he issued a decree. He banned the poppy, and because the Taliban ruled by fear, the ban worked. It was the most effective counter-narcotics operation in human history. In a single growing season, the world's largest opium crop vanished. Production dropped by over 90%. The fields of Helmand went bare. The global heroin supply dried up. For one brief moment, the flow stopped, but history has a way of intervening. On September 11, 2001, planes struck the World Trade Center. The Taliban's guests, Al-Qaeda, had declared war on America. Weeks later, American bombs began to fall on Kandahar. The Taliban regime collapsed. And who did the United States hire to help hunt down Osama bin Laden? The old warlords, the Northern Alliance, the very same men who had run the drug trade in the 1980s. With the Taliban gone and the warlords back in power, the ban was lifted. The farmers, destitute after a year without income, rushed back to the fields under the watchful eyes of NATO troops and American Marines. The poppy bloomed like never before. Production didn't just return to normal, it doubled, then tripled. The tragedy of the American occupation was total. The US military was there to fight terrorism, but to destroy the poppy fields was to destroy the livelihood of the unimaginable rural poor, pushing them straight into the arms of the insurgency. Meanwhile, the Taliban, now hiding in the mountains as insurgents, returned to the trade they had once banned. They needed money for IEDs. They needed money for suicide vests. The poppy became the ATM of the insurgency. Think about the cycle. The American taxpayer spent trillions of dollars to fight a war in Afghanistan. That war was fought against an enemy funded by selling heroin. That heroin flowed into Europe and America, destroying the communities of the very soldiers sent to fight the war. It was a self-licking ice cream cone of misery. A war feeding a drug trade, and a drug trade feeding a war. By 2010, Afghanistan supplied 90% of the world's illicit opiates. The graveyard of empires had become the garden of the world's addiction. But while the eyes of the world were fixed on the mountains of the Hindu Kush, a new threat was growing. It wasn't coming from a cave in Tora Bora, it was coming from a boardroom in Connecticut. The poppy was about to be rebranded. It was about to put on a suit and tie. While the Taliban were taxing opium trucks in the Hindu Kush, a different kind of cartel was forming in Stamford, Connecticut. They didn't wear turbans or carry AK-47s. They wore bespoke suits. They were the Sackler family, owners of a company called Purdue Pharma. For a century, doctors had treated the poppy with fear. They knew morphine was a miracle for the dying, but a curse for the living. They guarded it jealously, reserving it for end-of-life cancer care or acute trauma. They respected the demon. But the Sacklers looked at that caution and saw a missed opportunity. They saw a vast untapped market, the millions of Americans suffering from boring, everyday pain, backaches, arthritis, sports injuries. If they could convince doctors to prescribe powerful opioids for these people, they would be richer than the Medicis. In 1996, they launched their weapon, OxyContin. It was essentially pure oxycodone, a chemical cousin of heroin, packed into a pill, but Purdue had a gimmick. They claimed the pill had a time-release mechanism. It would dissolve slowly over 12 hours, and then they told the lie. They launched the most aggressive marketing campaign in pharmaceutical history. They sent thousands of sales reps to doctors' offices with a slick, simple message, because the drug is released slowly. The risk of addiction is less than 1%. Less than 1%. It was a statistical fabrication. It was a fantasy. But they sold it with the force of gospel. They funded seminars declaring that pain is the fifth vital sign, that it should be checked and treated just like blood pressure or heart rate. If a patient was in pain, it was a doctor's moral duty to extinguish it. Doctors, wanting to help, lowered their guard. They started handing out OxyContin like candy. The result was a massacre. It turned out the time-release coating could be defeated in about 5 seconds. You just crushed the pill or chewed it, and even if you swallowed it whole. The human body is not a machine. It craved the dopamine. Grandmothers getting knee replacements got hooked. High school quarterbacks with torn ACLs got hooked. Factory workers in the Rust Belt, trying to push through a double shift, got hooked. Purdue Pharma made roughly $35 billion. Yes, the Sacklers put their name on museum wings in London and New York. And meanwhile, in the hills of Appalachia and the suburbs of Ohio, the morgues began to fill up. When the government finally realized what was happening, they panicked. In the late 2000s, they cracked down, they tightened regulations, they shut down the pill mills. They made it hard to get a prescription, and this is the moment where our two stories, the ancient poppy and the modern corporation, collide in a catastrophic synthesis. Imagine a construction worker in Ohio. He's been taking legal OxyContin for 3 years to fix his back. Suddenly his doctor says, "I can't write this anymore. He isn't a criminal. He is sick. His brain has been rewired by the drug. He is facing the sickness, the vomiting, the shaking, the bone-deep agony of withdrawal. He needs a fix. A pill on the black market now costs $80. He can't afford it." But a dealer in the parking lot offers him a small balloon of brown powder for $10. It's heroin. And where did it come from? It came from the fields of Afghanistan, or the mountains of Mexico, grown by farmers caught in the gears of the drug wars we discussed earlier. The crackdown on pills didn't stop the addiction. It just pushed millions of Americans from the pharmacy to the street. The prescription wave broke, and the heroin wave washed over the country. But the poppy had one final, cruel evolution left. The drug cartels are businesses. And like any business, they want to cut costs. Growing poppies is hard. You need land, you need water, you have to wait for the harvest, you have to smuggle bulky plant matter. What if you didn't need the plant at all? Enter fentanyl. Synthesized in a lab, mostly in China or Mexico. It is 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. You don't need a field of flowers, you just need a chemistry set. A shoebox of fentanyl can get a whole city high. A few grains, the size of salt crystals, can kill you. Traffickers started mixing it into the heroin to make it stronger. Then they started pressing it into fake pills that looked like OxyContin. This is the third wave of the crisis. It is the end of the line. The poppy has been made obsolete by its own chemical children. We've reached the point where a teenager buying a pill on Snapchat doesn't know if they are buying a medicine or a murder weapon. The link to nature is severed. The flower is gone. Only the poison remains. The story that began with the Neolithic farmer scraping a pod in a field has ended with the synthetic crystal cooked in a basement. We've travelled a long road tonight, from the stone-tipped tools of the Neolithic farmers to the gilded palaces of Beijing. From the dark holds of the clipper ships to the sterile, bright offices of Purdue Pharma for 6,000 years. The human race has been locked in a dance with this fragile flower. We have worshipped it as a god. We have burned it as a demon. We have built the wealthiest empires in history on its back, and we've watched it tear those same empires apart from the inside. We tried to ban it with imperial edicts. We tried to tax it with the Taliban. We tried to synthesize it with German chemistry. And we tried to rebrand it with American marketing. Every single time we failed, the flower always won. Why? Because the story of the poppy isn't really about a plant. It's about us. The poppy is a mirror. It reflects our deepest, most terrifying vulnerabilities. It shows us that for all our steel and steam engines, for all our skyscrapers and smartphones, we are still just biological creatures terrified of pain. We are desperate for relief, and we are prone to a greed so profound that we will sell our own neighbours into slavery for a quarterly profit. But there is another reflection in that mirror, if we look hard enough. The history of opium teaches us that we cannot win a war against pain by inflicting more pain. We cannot bomb a poppy field into submission, and we cannot arrest our way out of an epidemic. The only moments of grace in this long, dark history were the moments of humanity. It was Lin Zexu trying to cure the addicts before he fought the dealers. It is the paramedic today carrying Narcan to save a stranger's life. It is the community that chooses to see an addict not as a criminal to be caged, but as a human being who is hurting. The flower is not evil. It is just a flower. It contains the power to numb a surgery and the power to stop a heart. It is indifferent. The choice of how to use it, whether as a tool of mercy or a weapon of greed, has always been ours. As we look at the crisis today, with fentanyl erasing the line between nature and chemistry, the lesson of history is clear. We will never conquer the poppy. We can only learn to respect its power, and more importantly, to value the lives of the people it threatens. The milk of paradise flows through the veins of our history. It is a part of us. The question is not how to destroy it, but how to survive it. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows. If this story gave you a new perspective on the world we live in, please share it. History is a heavy burden, but it is lighter when we carry it together. This is the historian's desk, and until next time, be careful what you plant,